Okay, good afternoon, everybody. You're very welcome to the second seminar of this semester at the Geary Institute for Public Policy. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. David Horan, who's a Marie Curie IRC Caroline Fellow at the School of Politics and International Relations in University College Dublin. David's background is in economics. He received his PhD from the European University Institute in Florence. He has lectured widely in economics, particularly at undergraduate level at DCU and Oxford Brookes University. He's recently returned to Ireland, having spent 2 years working with the UN on sustainable development. And today, David's going to be talking to us about his work and research on enabling integrated policy making with the Sustainable Development Goals and application to Ireland. Again, before David starts, a reminder that all questions should be directed to me, the chair, through the question and answer format here on webinar. So without further ado, David, over to you.
Okay, thanks a million, Doran. I'm delighted you could all join here today. Just before we start, I want to give a special thanks to Philip for the invite and to express my sympathies to him and his family at this time. I also want to thank David Farrell for the initial idea of giving a seminar here today. Okay, so just to give you an outline of the talk. Okay, so I'll give a short introduction firstly to the 2030 agenda, and then an overview of the project that I've been working on the SDGs. So most of the talk will deal with a paper that I recently published in September on enabling policy coherence. And then at the end, I'll mention its relationship to the overall project. And hopefully then we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A. Okay, so just to start on the 2030 agenda, a way to think about it is that as an international agreement, it sets the agenda at global level for sustainable development. And it does this in terms of a framework of 17 goals, 169 targets, and 232 official indicators. So the goals and targets were agreed in 2015, and the indicators were agreed in 2017. And obviously, it's quite a broad framework in that it covers many different policy areas. Now, another interesting feature of the agenda is that it outlines 7 means of implementation. And today, I'm just going to focus on 3 of these in different ways. The first is policy coherence for sustainable development. The second is data and monitoring. And the third is partnerships. Okay, and partnerships are given quite a unique role in terms of harnessing the other means of implementation. So at a general level, 2 key challenges for implementation are, first of all, the interlinkages. So there's lots of literature on how strongly integrated the goals and targets are. So how can we account for this in implementation? How can we account for these linkages? And then the second challenge is the need for transformation. So what this means is it's a call essentially for a shift away from incremental approaches to policy changes or single interventions towards a more combined approach. So a good example that kind of gets at the spirits of the 2030 agenda here in Ireland was the recent coupling of the carbon tax with the Just Transition Fund. So it's this type of policy mix or portfolio of interventions approach that's very much in line with the agenda. Okay, so I've been working on the SDGs for the last 2.5 years, and my work mainly focuses on developing a framework for implementation to achieve, in particular, the environmental SDGs. So there are 2 strands to my research. The first focuses on developing indicator-based methods that can account for the interlinkages to support a more integrated approach to implementation. And then the second strand focuses on partnerships, in particular portfolios of partnerships and how they could be better tuned to the type of transformations that are discussed in the SDG literature. So in working on partnerships, until quite recently, I've mainly been applying an economic analysis to basically identify problems with the frameworks that generate those portfolios. And now I'm using more methods in political science to study actual databases of partnerships and to understand how these can be better tuned to transition. Okay, so in this work, I have benefited from, I've been involved with a number of organizations that are leaders in the field of, global leaders in the field of SDGs. So it's a Caroline project. It's funded by the IRC and the European Commission. The host organization is University College Dublin, School of Politics and International Relations. And my mentor there is Professor David Farrell. And for the last 2 years, until the end of August last year, I was a visiting researcher at the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, where my mentor was Emma Torres. And during that time, I was also a visiting scholar at Columbia University's Center for Sustainable Development, hosted by Professor Jeffrey Sachs. And in New York, I engaged a lot at UNDESA, which is the Secretariat for the SDGs, and it organizes many of the events that bring together at the global level and the SDGs. And Paul Walsh was instrumental in setting up my secondment. So now in terms of outputs, there's been 5 journal publications so far and 1 policy brief. So on the left-hand side, these are publications that deal with the partnership strand. And on the right-hand side are 3 publications that deal with my indicator work. And today I just want to speak to you about one of these, and that's the article titled Enabling Integrated Policymaking with the SDGs, an application to Ireland, and a policy brief titled Assessing Baselines and Coordinating Actions for the SDGs, Decade of Action, related to this paper was also published recently. And that appeared in the IISD Knowledge Hub, which is widely read by the global SDG community. Okay, so that's all I want to say on the project, and now we're going to turn to the paper, which is the main focus today. Okay, so in the 2030 agenda, target 17.4 calls on governments to implement the SDGs in a coherent way. Now, coherence can mean a variety of different things, but type of coherence I'm focusing on in this paper is the integration of policies across line ministries within government. So focusing on the national level. Okay, and mainly on the within country policies. So the problem for this type of integration is that basically governments are not well organized to deal with the many interlinkages that exist between the SDGs. In practice, the responsibility for implementation is typically divided among ministries who specialize in and prioritize very different areas. So in Ireland's National Implementation Plan, which was published in 2018 for the period to 2020, it gives a very clear outline of how the responsibilities for implementing the different goals and targets have been divided among the ministries at that time. And just to illustrate the problem that the paper deals with, if we focus on SDG 14, which is about the conservation and sustainable use of marine resources, according to the National Implementation Plan, the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Governments has primary responsibility for the implementation of that goal. Now, the International Council for Science in 2017 produced a report that analyzed the interlinkages between this marine goal and the other SDGs. And that analysis identified 97 potential target level interactions with the other SDGs. And in particular, it noted strong interactions on SDGs 1, 2, 3, 8, 12, and 13. And among other interactions. And basically, despite these clear connections, in Ireland's National Implementation Plan, responsibility for these other goals rests primarily with these departments. So the question is, how should departments take account of these interlinkages when it attempts to meet its particular responsibilities on implementation? Okay, so to deal with the problem, there are two main approaches outlined in the literature, and both of these approaches focus on enhancing cooperation among ministries. So the first approach is called a whole of government approach, whereby policies are agreed by all departments. Now, this approach is very popular in policy circles and usually finds expression in terms of interdepartmental working groups. And many countries have set these up, including Ireland, to facilitate integrated SDG policy making. Now, in a recent study by Newig in 2019, who looked at these working groups, that study found no significant evidence on their effectiveness. Okay, that was an econometric analysis, cross-country analysis of the factors influencing SDG achievement, and one of those was on governance arrangements at national level. Okay, which explicitly looked at those working groups. Now, the other approach is called a nexus approach, and this usually focuses on promoting collaborations, usually among a small number of departments. So this approach is very popular in the academic literature on long-term planning through modeling. And it typically discusses issues that are highly interconnected, a small number of issues that are highly interconnected, like water, energy, food, in a combined manner. Now, in trying to apply these approaches to the problem, neither of them seem very satisfactory. So the whole of government approach appears to advocate nearly too much cooperation. Okay, it's advocating cooperation amongst all departments, considering potentially all linkages. When it's not, it's not clear that everything is connected to each other, that everything is connected to everything, at least in a first order sense. On the other hand, the nexus approach seems to be proposing too little cooperation, in that clearly there are interlinkages beyond the nexus that should be taken account of. Now, there are two main research gaps in the literature. The first is there's a lack of technical tools to systematically bring together the relevant government departments. Okay, so on my paper addresses this as one gap. Now, there's a second related problem that's more fundamental in that basically ministries themselves, and this is to deal with, in the literature, there are no proposals on how ministries should deal with their own internal monitoring and evaluation systems. So often how they evaluate their own performance is in quite a narrow sense. So in thinking about how they perform, it's usually based on sector-specific performance, on sector-specific considerations that are relevant to their specialism. Now, what the paper proposes is broadening those systems by incorporating indicators in related or interconnected policy areas. So the main idea here is to use indicators as communication and coordination devices between government departments. And so just to give you an example, imagine that you're the department responsible for marine affairs and that you're concerned with reducing marine pollution. And this is interconnected with, let's say, for example, poverty reduction or sustainable agriculture. So if you take indicators for poverty or sustainable agriculture and put them into and require that the Department of the Marine, to some extent at least, cares about outcomes on those indicators, then they can act as a useful signal if there's, say, for example, a negative trend in poverty or more unsustainable agricultural practices. This can act as a useful communication device that marine policies need to be integrated into anti-poverty policy and agricultural practices. So, so that's the main idea. How to do this? So the paper advocates a dashboard approach rather than a headline index, basically because of the many interlinkages. A dashboard approach would seem more appropriate to try and link together these different departments through monitoring and evaluation. Now, the idea isn't that unusual. We're often used to thinking about indicators as communication devices, but it's normally in a different context. It's between, say, scientists who produce information and decision makers like voters and politicians. And there the emphasis tends to be put on more headline indices. Whereas policymakers have to design policies and connect with many different areas, and they tend to require more structured information. So for that reason, I'm advocating a dashboard approach. Okay, so what does the paper actually do? Well, first of all, it proposes a monitoring tool that government departments can use in Ireland to work together with other departments on integrated policy making. Secondly, it demonstrates by way of an example to SDG 14 the role that dashboards of interrelated indicators could play in coordination. And thirdly, then it presents a method for indicator selection and uses gap analysis to, first of all, provide an assessment of Ireland's performance on SDG 14 in an integrated way. And secondly, then to develop specific proposals for which departments should cooperate and what policy areas discussions should focus on in those cooperations, in that cooperation. Okay, so the main recommendations, just to put this up front, is first of all that Ireland's department with lead responsibility for SDG 14 achievement should cooperate with 9 other departments on 15 policy issues. So if you note, there's 16 at that time, 2018 to 2020, there was 16 departments in Ireland. So this is considerably less than a whole of government approach, but it's considerably more than a nexus approach. And it goes a little bit further by trying to nail down specifically what policy issues need to be addressed in order to integrate policies. And secondly, then the paper proposes embedding the approach in ministry monitoring and evaluation systems to incentivize integrated policy making, particularly in the policy preparation stage. Okay, and I give in the article a brief a paragraph where I explain how this could be done, in a much more using national statistical offices and organizing consultations on how to identify linkages. Okay, now I'd like to bring your attention to the method for indicator selection. So this is a 5-step procedure. And I'm going to go into some detail now on the different steps and how I constructed the dashboard for the assessment. Okay, so in step 1, this focuses on defining the focal points. So to start, the department and targets of interest need to be defined. So we're starting locally here. And Now there's quite a bit of text on this slide here, but I just ask you to focus here firstly on the left, which identifies the targets that I used for the study. So I used 4 marine targets to assess progress on SDG 14. And 2 of these are conservation related targets. The first one relates to reducing marine pollution, and the second one to increasing protection of marine areas. And then the other 2 targets relate to fisheries. The first one to enhancing sustainable fisheries, and the other one to raising economic benefits from the fisheries sector. Now, if I can bring your attention to the right-hand side here, this presents then which departments, according to the National Implementation Plan, have responsibility for each of these targets. So you can see responsibility is divided amongst 3 different departments. And for the purposes of this study, I took the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government as the lead government department. And the main reason for that is that in Ireland, it has lead responsibility for marine spatial planning. So it seemed to me like the most appropriate ministry to take as having lead responsibility on this goal. Okay, so once that's done, the next step then focus on choosing the methods to assess progress. And to assess Ireland's performance in SDG 14, in this study, a cross-country baseline assessment was conducted, and I'll speak a little bit later about the peer group that was selected for the study. Okay, so once you have the targets of interest, then you can start building the interlinkages around that. So the next step is the identification of linkages with the other SDGs. So, sorry, between the targets of interest and the other SDGs. So for this step, I use the ICSU study analysis of SDG 14 linkages to identify potential interactions. And my analysis focused on identifying the first order interactions at goal level. So as is common with studies on interlinkages, you usually summarize your findings in a table or with a network or a matrix. In the paper, I summarized the analysis using a table. And at the top here, what we have is the potential interactions of progress on SDG 14 and the other goals. And at the bottom here, what we have is the potential influence of progress on the other goals on the achievement of SDG 14. So what you can see is, like most of these studies, there's pervasive okay, so there are many potential interactions. Positive ones tend to be more, tend to dominate the negative ones in a ratio of 2 to 1. And not everything interacts with everything, at least in the first order sense, but some goals have more pervasive interactions than others. Okay, so once you have that done, then you can move to the next step, which is to actually select the indicators based on that analysis. So for this, I used 4 criteria to select indicators. I focused only on the official SDG indicators. And I chose indicators that were, first of all, relevant to the targets of interest, and secondly, relevant to the linkages. So for the second step, the idea here was once a linkage had been identified, to choose the best available indicator for that particular linkage. And the fourth condition was that they be limited in number. Now, most indicators were selected from the Sustainable Development Report, and to broaden the scope of my assessment, because there were data gaps, that's a feature of using official indicators, I brought in proxy indicators as well, and these were contained in the Sustainable Development Report. So just to give you an example of the procedure for selecting indicators for linkages and how I used proxy indicators, in this slide, we're looking here at SDG 16 and 17, where there are often quite large data gaps. So if you look here on the left in the linkage column, so from the analysis of linkages, we know that better quality institutions, more inclusive decision-making, and greater mobilization of finance are all important for, are potentially important for the achievement of SDG 14. Now, when we go to the official list of UN indicators for these, most of them are classified as tier 2, which means there's not enough data available. And for that reason, I selected proxy indicators for each of them. And these were taken from the SDSN indicator sets. So for quality of institutions, freedom of the press was used. And for inclusive decision-making, seats held by women in national parliaments was used. Now, for the other indicator, a tier 1 indicator is available, but it's not relevant in the sense that it's to do with ODA, and the focus of our study is domestically in Ireland. So what I did in that case was the best available indicator was government spending on health and education, and I chose this as a proxy for mobilization of finance for sustainable development. Okay, so once you have your indicator set, then the step 5 then is to assign the responsibilities for each of these indicators. So to do this, I used the National Implementation Plan that I mentioned to you earlier to identify the lead department with responsibility for implementing the SDG target related to that specific indicator. Okay, and I did this for each of the indicators. So going through that procedure, this results then in a dashboard of 33 indicators, 4 of which are related to SDG 14 and 29 of which are linked to performance on SDG 14. So the indicators are linked here in the middle column, and the departments with lead responsibility attached for each of those indicators are listed here in the column beside it. Now, overall, when we started out with 16 government departments in Ireland in that period, this process identified 12 government departments that are directly linked to the achievement of SDG 14. So that includes the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government, but it also includes departments like the Department of Finance, the Department of Communications, Climate Action and the Environment, Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine. Okay, so this is just the first half of the dashboard, and the second half here you have all of the indicators. That's the other indicators that were selected, and here we have again the departmental responsibilities. So you see the Department of Health features, also the Department of Business, Enterprise and Innovation down here for SDG 17, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade also features. Okay, so in order to conduct the integrated assessment, what I did was to account for interlinkages. I grouped these indicators into 3 different components that expressed the potential causal interrelations with SDG 14 achievements. Okay, and I called these pressures. There's 3 components, sorry. There's pressures, impacts, and responses. So anyone who's familiar with environmental assessment reports will be aware of these pressure, impacts, response type frameworks. So I basically applied that to the assessment of SDG performance. Okay, so the 29 indicators were divided into 3 components with 10 pressures. So these are indicators that potentially influence performance on SDG 14. So for example, nitrogen use in agriculture can potentially exacerbate marine pollution. Similarly, wastewater treatment. The second category then was 11 impacts. So these are indicators that are potentially influenced by the achievement of SDG 14. So for example, more sustainable fisheries can, through better diets, lower better nutrition, lower the prevalence of obesity in the population. More cleaner marine environments can improve subjective well-being. And the third category then are responses, which really reflect country capacities to manage these interrelations. So examples are things like education, science and technology, and corruption. These can all have an influence both on SDG 14's achievements, but also the effects of the pressures on that achievement. So the idea is that, there are many. Why am I packaging indicators in this manner? Well, there's a lot of interlinkages, and this reduces the complexity in a nice way that's communicatable between policymakers. Okay, so to conduct the baseline assessments, to measure Ireland's current performance on each indicator, I used the min-max normalization. So where X here is the current or observed performance on the indicator, and A is the minimum value or worst value, and B is the target value. So all this data, minimum and target values for each indicator, were taken from SDSN's 2019 Sustainable Development Report for the year 2018. Now, to help identify strengths and challenges on each indicator, a traffic light color coding scheme was used. So here basically differences in the normalized score of more than 20 points were taken to be considerable. So just on the color coding scheme, green signifies that the target is achieved, yellow signifies that challenges remain, orange signifies that there are significant challenges, and red signifies major challenges. Okay, so bringing it all together, we can use radar diagrams then to provide an integrated assessment of Ireland's baseline for implementing SDG 14. So I divided the assessment into two steps. So first we just look at how Ireland performs on SDG 14, ignoring the interlinkages. And what you can see here in terms of priorities, in terms of challenges faced, are that Ireland faces particular challenges on major challenges on marine protected areas, and significant challenges on reducing marine pollution. We perform better on sustainable fisheries and raising economic benefits from fisheries, but some challenges still remain. Okay, so when we turn to accounting for the interlinkages, if you look first at potential pressures on marine performance, we see that challenges remain on sustainable agriculture, wastewater treatment in particular, renewable energy expansion also, municipal waste, climate action, and biodiversity threats. Okay, so most of the challenges are on pressures. However, there are also some challenges on country capacities to improve marine performance, according to these diagrams. These are in areas of science and technology, inclusive decision-making, and government spending in support of sustainable development. Okay, and while the country seems to do quite well in terms of impacts, there are a small number of areas where improved marine performance could potentially lead to better outcomes. One is on nutrition, another is on gender equality, and another is on employment. Okay, so what the paper then does is it takes those findings of the integrated assessments and matches them with the different government departments. Okay, in order to develop recommendations for who should cooperate and on what policy areas the discussions should focus. So in this table, the rows are the departments to engage in the cooperation, and each entry are policy areas for discussion. And you can see that I've used the gap analysis to grade these according to the level of challenges faced on those particular indicators. So, and in the top here, then we're accounting for the interlinkages. So we've divided the different policy areas into pressures, impacts, and country capacities, as well as performance and the goal itself. Okay, so the main recommendations are that the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government should cooperate with 9 other departments to address challenges in 15 policy areas. Specifically, cooperation is proposed with the Department of Communications, Climate Action and the Environment on 3 policy areas. The Department of Agriculture, Food, Marine, Business, Enterprise and Innovation, Justice and Equality and Protection in 2 areas. And then for the remaining, cooperation is also proposed with the Department of Health, Climate and Culture and the Gaeltacht, Finance and Foreign Affairs and Trade on 1 area. Okay, and according to the analysis, most challenges arise on pressures in 6 areas, capacities in 4 areas, country capacities on 3 areas, and on marine performance, there are 2 areas that the Department of Housing and Planning needs to address as well. Okay, and some examples of major priorities to address include major challenges on pressures, including climate action, renewable energy, and waste management with the Department of Communications, Climate Action and the Environment, as well as remaining challenges on capacities, particularly on finance with the Department of Finance, science and innovation with Business, Enterprise and Innovation, corruption with the Justice Department, and inclusive decision making as well. Okay, so that's how far you can go in terms of proposals, at least with that type of analysis. Now, you can also add an extra layer to the recommendations by doing a cross-country comparisons. And what I'm trying to get at here is whether Ireland is acting as a leader or a laggard on specific challenges. So this is quite useful could be quite useful discussions with other ministries to know whether, well, is the challenge due to us not implementing better policies in use elsewhere, or is the gap in performance with other countries due to a difference in fundamentals with other countries? So the paper gives a kind of an exploratory analysis of how to do this. It defines Ireland to be a laggard if current performance differs considerably by more than 20 points from peers sharing similar fundamentals. So actually what I'm doing here is the most different system design and most similar system, mixing most similar system designs methods. So the peer group was taken to be the UK, Iceland, New Zealand and Japan, who are all island states and belonging to the OECD, so similar in terms of geography, levels of development, and with well-developed fishery sectors, so ruling out countries like Malta, for example. And these are fundamental variables that could affect SDG achievement, which are taken from the study by Newick. So remoteness is a geography variable, population is population size, Western is whether it's considered a Western is a cultural variable, and governance is whether it's a member of the EU or not. So sharing similar governments with Ireland. So then the challenge is to try to understand how much of the difference in performance on a particular indicator reflects non-commitments to better policies elsewhere. So if we just take 2 examples, if we look at marine pollution, so Ireland's performance compared to Iceland and New Zealand, is considerably worse here, differs by more than 20 points. But can we say that Ireland is a laggard? Well, it's difficult on this particular variable because of we're comparing to Iceland and New Zealand, who have a much more remote geographic location than we have, been closer to major agglomerations of industrial activity. So for that particular indicator, it's much more nuanced whether it's the gap in performance is due to underlying fundamental constraints and improving sustainability, or whether it is due to we're just not adopting better practices in Iceland or New Zealand. Now, to take an area where things are much more clearer, if you look at protected areas, so this is amount of the exclusive economic zone that is actually protected. So in Ireland, we perform considerably worse than the UK, New Zealand, and Japan on this variable. Okay, only 2.3% of our EEZ is actually protected, compared to 7.2% in Japan, and it's well above 10%, which is the globally agreed target in the UK and New Zealand. Now, you cannot easily explain this difference by geographic location, since we have a similar location to the UK. You can't easily explain it by population size either, because New Zealand is doing quite well on this indicator. And you can't easily explain it either by our governance structure or cultural issues, because the UK is doing well on this particular variable. So for that reason, there's good reason to believe that Ireland is a laggard when it comes to marine protection. So that's the type of procedure of analysis, and you can extend it to all the other variables that are linked to marine performance. So just to give you an example, we also seem to be, according to this analysis, a laggard on wastewater treatment. It's more difficult to say in renewable energy, because while countries like Iceland and are doing quite well, and New Zealand, they have different geographic endowments of renewable resources to us. So it's slightly more nuanced than that. But that's the general idea behind the procedure. And just to show you, you can go from there then to a ranking of each of the policy areas, which is quite useful for discussing with other ministries, of how we're doing on the particular areas for policy discussion. So L here means leader, and so for example in fisheries it appears that we're a leader on this indicator, even though challenges remain, whereas we appear to be lagging particularly on things like municipal waste, renewable energy, and climate action. Sorry, climate action is N here means nuanced, so it's not possible to say based on the available data. Okay, so overall, oh, sorry, just before we go to that, so the main recommendation from that type of analysis is that Ireland appears to be leading on 3 policy areas and lagging on 9, and the rest it's kind of it's nuanced. So the overall conclusion from the paper is that while the tool offers a useful starting point for discussions on integrated policy making, okay, it doesn't measure the strength of the interactions between the policy areas, but it's at least the starting point that ministries, when you bring them together, can use to start discussing ways to integrate policies. So in this sense, it should be seen as a complement to national policy work. I mean, a lot of reports go into a lot of a huge wealth of detail on specific policy areas, and they bring that to the table. And after that, it's to try and, by bringing the relevant departments to the table, it's to try and find ways to, opportunities and challenges for integrating policies across sectors. Now, the approach, the method presented in the paper can be applied to other departments and SDG priorities. Basically, because of the, we have this mapping in the National Implementation Plan. Now, it does need to be updated to reflect the change in government, but we're quite lucky to have that. A lot of other countries say they divide up the SDGs, but amongst departments, but they don't actually show in how much detail this was done. Now, you could also apply the approach to other SDGs. There's a very large literature on linkages. Now is over hundreds of papers, and you can use the mappings in those papers to identify the other types of interlinkages. So if you're interested in how the Department of Health should cooperate with other departments, for example, that ICSU study actually does a mapping of the interlinkages between the health goal and other indicators. Alternatively, you can organize, one could organize, these could be organized, those types of consultations with experts and stakeholders and mapping out the linkages. Okay, at the end of the paper, I make this point that adoption of the approach by government may support the emergence of two-pronged organization within government departments. So the idea behind two-pronged organization is that basically you have some policymakers who are like specialists in the department who focus on projects that are really the core business of the department. But around that, you have a layer of what I call multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary type policymakers who are there to assess interlinkages with other policy areas. Okay, so a little bit like what's going on in universities, this type of a two-pronged structure between disciplinary research and interdisciplinary research, but in this case applied to government departments. Okay, so that's all I want to say on the paper. I just want to briefly mention some relationships to the overall project. So there will be a report at some point this year, and I'm going to apply the methods to the other environmental SDGs 13 and 15. And that report chapter will focus on policy partnerships that can support the implementation of the environmental SDGs. So what I'm curious in knowing in this is just how different, you know, the recommendations on cooperation are across SDGs, and also a challenge here is to try and map out the actual interlinkages for those goals. And second way I've been using the tool in my work is to apply it to study of partnerships. And here I'm trying to extend the methods to include other stakeholders. And this brings up quite a few different issues, but about, first of all, you don't have this nice mapping you have in the National Implementation Plan to show where the responsibilities lie. So you have to go about it in some other procedure. So for this, I'm looking at the, I'm studying 500 partnerships in the environmental partnerships in the SIDS database, and trying to develop a procedure for identifying responsibilities based on who is participating. And there'll be a special article on this tool to coordinate these partnerships later this year. Okay, sorry for the phone call there at the end, but thanks for your attention, and I'm happy now to turn to questions.